So today we're going to talk about co-sponsorship, but before we get into co-sponsorship, we're going to talk about who refugees are, how they become refugees, their journey, what happens to them on the global scale, how they get here. Then we'll go into co-sponsorship, kind of bullet point details of it. Lots of opportunities for questions and answers after that time. Refugee resettlement is information heavy. So I'm going to apologize now for all the words I'm going to be giving to you today. It's going to be a lot to digest. Sometimes when I get excited, I start talking fast, so feel free to tell me to slow it down or to repeat something. All right, so refugees. A refugee is a legal status. The media uses it fairly broadly, but it's actually a fairly specific legal status that has to include a border crossing. So a refugee is a person who has been forced to flee his or her homeland and is unable to return because he or she has experienced persecution or has a well-founded fear of persecution. And this persecution can be based on a number of things: their race, their religion, their ethnicity, their social group, a political group, a wide variety of things. It can be on a broad scale. It can be on a very narrow scale. One of our case managers was a high-standing, well-respected journalist in Somalia, and he had to flee because of political affiliations. But there are plenty of Somalians who've had to flee for a variety of other reasons. So a lot of people ask, can a refugee be a refugee? Can someone be a refugee because of a national disaster, say a tsunami or a flood or a famine? And the general answer is no. Refugee has to be because of persecution. There could be famine as a result of, like in Somalia, they've had just constant turmoil within their governments since 1969. And so without a stable infrastructure, there hasn't been a way for food to be distributed throughout the country. So there is there's famine based on the war and the conflict going on. But if there's a drought and there's a famine, they can't be given refugee status because of that. Refugees are invited to come to the U.S. And it's a status that's granted overseas. So a refugee flees their homeland, they go to a refugee camp, they file for refugee status, their claims are verified. I recently read that 47% of all people who file for refugee status are denied because they are unable to verify their persecution claims. A refugee status is valid indefinitely. When a refugee arrives in the United States, they can live here as a refugee for the rest of their lives. Refugee status never expires. They are on a path to citizenship. They can get their green card in 1 year, citizenship in 5 years, but they can stay as refugee forever if they'd like. They can work legally upon arrival. When a refugee arrives, we're at the airport, we check their I-94 form that they have, has a stamp on it that says refugee, work authorized. So they can get a job as soon as they get off the plane. They can be, like I said, they can become citizens. They're eligible for most time-sensitive public benefits, and they're protected from being forcibly sent back, except in the case of criminal activity.
If the status in their home country changes, like things get better, is their status revoked?
No,
or
it's valid indefinitely. Things even out eventually. Most of the time, it just doesn't. There isn't peace established. They are never able to go back. Resettlement to a third country is always the final option. The first option would be that governments get their brains back and there's peace in their homelands and they can return. I think all of us would want to do that. We'd want to stay, go back to our home. That's always the primary option. That's always what the UNHCR is looking for. That's always what governments are looking for. Refugee camps, let's see peace come to these lands and people go back to their homes. That almost never happens. A second option would be for them to be patriated into their country of asylum. So if Kenya were to say, hey, let's let all the Somali and Congolese and Eritrean and Ethiopian refugees, let's let them become citizens. That would be ideal because it's less traumatic to be resettled into a country that's close to your own, where the language is spoken, where you understand everything. But that doesn't often happen either. So resettlement to a third country is the only option for most refugees. Okay, so once they flee their home, And this can be done, they could know ahead of time that they're hearing that there's war, that they know several villages away are being attacked, that there's general persecution, they could have a family member who's been persecuted, and they can plan to leave. If they have any paperwork, they can gather that paperwork, their money, any household goods that they need, and leave. And have a little bit of a safer, less traumatic fleeing. But generally, they have to leave in the middle of the night, or they have to leave at the last minute. Families get separated often in the whole fleeing experience. In the case of the Sudanese Lost Boys, they walked for thousands of miles before they found asylum in Kenya. And their numbers were originally about 20,000, and they ended up 5,000 to 6,000. So it's a terrifying ordeal to have to flee your home, to know that death is at your doorstep. A lot of times there isn't time to grab things that you need. There isn't time to grab birth certificates or marriage certificates if you have money, if you have it. There's just basically enough time to grab maybe a handful of things that you might need, some food, maybe a change of clothes, your children, and get out of there. So when a refugee arrives to the camp, they've been in this fight or flight mode for so long. And it's just their bodies become used to this adrenaline, constantly living on adrenaline, and they get to the camp and then they're stuck. They're in limbo. And it's quite a shift, and it creates a lot of tension in the camps to have people who have been through traumatic experiences, who are used to living in this traumatic, heightened life, and then now they're stuck. There's basic competition, a competition for basic needs like food and water and shelter. In the camps for the Burmese in Thailand, when they're ushered into the camp, they're kind of shown this empty spot with a pile of bamboo, says, here you go, build your house. So a lot of times there's just constant potholes ahead of them that really just add more and more insult to injury, and just constant degradation of having to flee and now being in this camp life where they're competing for food, they're competing for shelter. It's overcrowded. There's a camp called Dadaab in Kenya. It was built to house, I believe, about 80,000. Now there's upwards of 120,000 in the camp, and those numbers are growing because there's new conflicts in Congo now. There's still political and ethnic hostilities within the camp. So even though everybody's in the same boat as a refugee, it doesn't mean all their ethnicities get along. So there's still that rub inside the camp. There's little or no opportunity to pursue education or employment. Many of the older refugees, I would say 50 and up, are illiterate in their own languages, so they aren't able to pass on a lot of education to their children. There are NGOs, that stands for non-government organizations. They come in and provide education, but the need is just so great, there's just not enough to go around to provide education to everyone. Some of the kids who come from Kenya, the little kids, have some English. That's really nice to see. Some adults have English as well, but by and large, most people who are coming do not have a lot of English. There's a lot of tedium. There's a lot of twiddling thumbs. There's a lot of waiting. There's no jobs really in the camps. The few lucky can work with the UNHCR in some capacity, but in general, there's no jobs. There's no opportunity to develop habits that create a successful life here, habits that we all have, like getting up in the morning at the same time, going to work every day that we're scheduled, staying the whole time, clocking out, coming home, paying bills, making it to medical appointments. These are all things that they've never had the opportunity to do in camps. They don't have those habits established. So then that creates another hurdle for them when they get here. There's not a lot of hope for the future for them in the camps. There's no jobs, so there's no prosperity. They're kind of living just by what's given to them, wearing clothes that are given to them, eating food that's given to them, living in a house that was shown to them. There's not a lot of creating with their own hands and creating their own future. And the average amount of time people spend in a camp is 15 years. We had a family come in just the other week. They were born in the camps. They were in their 30s. And they had their children in the camps. So a lot of people are spending decades in camps before they're able to make their way here. There's a lot of the camps can be unhygienic because of the overcrowding, and there's no plumbing and electricity. So it can become a very unsafe place for refugees. Here's Kaukama Refugee Camp in Kenya. As you can see, they're just kind of rows and rows and rows of the same little hut. Not a lot of privacy, Not a lot of security, definitely no flushing toilets in there. Not a lot of opportunity to develop skills like farming. There, I mean, it's just pretty desolate there. Here's Dadaab, the camp that I mentioned earlier. It's the big aerial view of it. I'm always constantly caught by the kind of murky areas in the picture, just thinking, I mean, if you go and Google Dadaab camp, the pictures will break your heart of the life that they have to live in the camps. And it's a safe life and they're alive, but it's really kind of a non-life while they're there. Here's Mae La camp in Thailand. In the Thai camps, they are not allowed to leave the camps. I was told by a former client who came here as a single Karen woman 6 years ago. She has had a very successful life here. She works for Dungarvan, and she just graduated with her bachelor's degree in social services, and she's going on to get her master's degree. But she was in Mae La. She said that the Thai army would shoot you if you left the camps. So they are confined to the camps. You can kind of see the fence here. I mean, it's not a very, it's not a Trump wall or anything, but it's still a fence. And they aren't allowed to leave. And it's in similar conditions as other camps, overcrowding and unhygienic situations. Some of our staff got to visit Mae La a couple years ago, and it was quite heartbreaking for them to see the conditions that people have to live in, waiting and waiting and waiting for a life to begin. So resettlement in the U.S., each year Congress and the President set a cap for the maximum number of refugees that can be admitted each year. We never reached the cap, ever. And it's been 70,000 for decades and decades and decades. But this year it was up to 85. We've been told it'll go up to 100,000 next year, but who knows? But this year it's set at 85. They also set the regions where people will come from. But in order to get here, it's an 18-month to 3-year process once their name is drawn, and it's their turn to stop waiting and start working towards third country resettlement. They have interviews with NGOs, the non-government agencies. Those are typically resettlement agencies. There's 9 national agencies who kind of help run the different areas of the globe. Their persecution claims are verified. There's interviews with Homeland Security, CIA, FBI. There's 17 security clearances. They have medical screenings, cultural orientation, and travel loan paperwork. Like every good American, they have debt when they arrive here. Every refugee who arrives has to sign paperwork saying that they will pay back all of their travel expenses, their air flight. Yes?
I just wanted to remind people, and check with you, I think the agency that our denominations both work through is Church World Service, right?
Yes, we contract with both Episcopal Migration Ministry and Church World Service. Yes, we contract with both of those. Medical screenings. I want to say here, there's only about 4 main countries who carry the heaviest load of numbers for resettlement. It's us, Canada, Sweden, and Australia. We have the highest numbers, not per capita, but the highest numbers overall. And other countries have a lot of restrictions on who they will accept into their country. Sometimes it's kind of limited towards, working age, and they have restrictions on medical conditions that they will accept. The U.S. has the least number of exceptions, which makes me very proud that we still continue to say, bring us your tired and your huddled masses. The only exceptions that we have are tuberculosis, criminal activity of a certain level, and any affiliation with terrorist activity.
What was the last one?
Terrorist activity. If they have if they're involved with terrorists at all, they are not eligible for resettlement in the U.S.
Excuse me, did you say
Yes.
that we don't ever fill it?
Yes, we never fill it. And I think it's mainly because there's just not enough, there's only so much housing, there's only so many jobs, there's only so much that can be funneled through the public systems right now that, sometimes things get bottlenecked and they have to say, okay, let's slow it down a little bit, let everybody get caught up. Because I would say housing is probably one of the big major issues, that there's only so much affordable housing to go around. I mean, our case managers are responsible for finding the housing for our families, and we have a number of landlords who we work with and housing companies we work with who take a big risk because we furnish the house and people live there before the lease is signed. So, I mean, that's a pretty big risk for them to take. And some property management companies don't want to take that risk. So there's only just so many houses. I wish that we could take the full number. And, sometimes there's just government slowdowns for for reasons that we aren't told. So you never know what's going on up there. So we are one of 5 resettlement agencies in Minnesota working with Episcopal Migration Ministries and Church World Service. There's us, Lutheran Social Services, Arrive Ministry, which was formerly World Relief, Catholic Charities, and International Institute in St. Paul. Our core services, we have 30 to 90 days of case management, which seems ridiculous to me that in 90 days we can expect somebody to be self-sufficient and to be doing these things on their own. It just seems ridiculous. I think about if my family was plunked down in Somalia, that I'm certain it would take longer than 90 days for me to learn the language and be able to navigate on the bus and work and figure things out. It would be such a traumatic experience. But we do all the pre-arrival preparations of finding housing, contacting any family members or friends that they have in the area. We connect them to ongoing employment and social services. And every refugee who arrives, whether they're newborn or 110 years old, receives a one-time grant of $925 per person, and that's supposed to last them until they're self-sufficient and paying their bills on their own. If it's a large family, that's okay. If they have, if it was my family, there's 8, so that would be okay. That would help us last longer. But if it's a family of 3, that $925 per person is pretty much going to be eaten up in their deposit in their first and second month's rent. So there's not a lot of leeway for them. They're really pushed very quickly to be fully self-sufficient, to have jobs and be paying all their own bills. Oh, and we do help them with their travel loan repayment as well, which they have to start paying back at 90 days. It's an interest-free loan. They can take a long time to pay it back, and 86% of all refugees pay back their travel loans. And I always want to check student loan numbers to see how that might compare. All right, any questions from the resettlement side before I jump into the co-sponsorship? Yes?
So would that include the recent Syrian refugees too? That basically there's no bypass lane for the...
There's no bypass lane, yeah. When pretty much everyone in the resettlement side of things, when, we're going to take 100,000 this year, we were just like laughing, just going, that's just a flat out lie. There's no way to push things through that quickly, and we wouldn't want to push things through that quickly. We want everyone to go through the same safety checks because resettlement is a very safe program. Never has there ever been a refugee ever arrested on any sort of domestic terrorist charge ever. And we want it to continue that way. And we really want the people who need to be here, who are genuinely refugees, to be the ones who are put through. But yeah, I don't yeah, and we probably won't see many, if any, Syrians here in Minnesota because we don't already have a Syrian population. And that's not to say we won't ever, because it only takes 5 or 6 families to create a community. And most of the people who come here know someone. We occasionally get a free case, which means they don't know anyone here. But generally, they have connections here, and they know that's why they're coming here. So, there could be Syrian families who come here, but we're not going to see large numbers like Phoenix or Detroit or Chicago or Houston will. Yes?
When they're in the refugee camps, how is it just a sort of first in, first out in terms of getting on a list for a country?
I think it's a variety of situations. It could be based on the longevity there. It's based on their qualifications for each country, and also who they may know. We've been told that there's 5 opportunities to say, I know someone in this place, I'll wait to go here. They could say, hey, my uncle is in Detroit, but my sister is in Sweden. It's going to be quicker to get to Detroit than to Sweden. I think it's a variety of factors, and it depends on what each country, which region they're accepting, and how many they're accepting. So it's really, in some ways it's a crapshoot where they're going to go.
Yeah, what do they have to do to prove that they are persecuted? The NGOs that run the certain areas are experts in their areas. They know the languages, they know the conflicts, they know the psychology of the people in those areas. And they do have to provide some sort of proof. They tell their stories over and over and over and over and over to make sure that there's a consistency in their stories. And there are even requirements that they provide, a phone number or a contact with somebody who can verify that yes, this did happen to them. And if there's any discrepancy in their stories, like if they say the first few times that, it was after breakfast that we had to flee, and then all of a sudden they say it was before lunch, even that minimal of a discrepancy, it's going to cause a flag that's going to have more interviews and more verification.
Asylum seekers,
Yes.
have they come here through a different?
Yes, they do. Asylum seekers come here first, most of the time through legal routes like on a tourist visa or a student visa, and then once they're here they file for asylum saying, I am persecuted, I cannot go back. I need my visa turned into a green card. It's a very long process to file for asylum and be granted asylum. It's like 3 years. It is a very...
They have not come through the camp.
They have not, they may have spent time there, but found other routes to get here. But mainly they come here through legal routes and then file for asylum once they're here. Until their asylum is granted, they're not eligible for public benefits. They aren't able to work. There's a lot of homelessness associated with asylum seekers until their asylum status is granted. We do have some asylees who come through our office, like once asylum is granted, they can file for refugee social services. And so then they're eligible for benefits through our office, but until they're granted asylum, there's nothing that can be, they really depend on the community to support them, or family members, or there are different churches. There's Mayflower, I think, yeah, Mayflower UCC does some work with asylees. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
We'll probably get at this. I'm just wondering about how they pay the rent for their lodging, their home.
Yes. Some of it is going to come out of their one-time grant for $925 a person.
Yeah.
That usually covers rent for a couple of months. Then they're expected to have a job and to be paying it on their own. Yeah. There are some families sign up for MFIP, which is the Minnesota Families Public Benefits. Though that's usually never enough to help cover their rent. Most of them are expected to be employed by the 3rd or 4th month and paying their own way.
And put in apartments.
Yes.
So like
Yes.
you have a
Larger families will go into homes
Mhm.
because the homes are larger and have more bedrooms.
Yeah.
But generally, yeah, apartments. Yeah. Yeah. And they're not rent controlled apartments, or they're not government assistance apartments. We put them in, they're not subsidized in any way. We put them in apartments that are going to be affordable, that they can pay for at lower wage jobs that they will have. We have a large network of employers who consistently employ refugees. It's wonderful, but they are low-skilled jobs, low-paying jobs. It's kind of the first rung on the employment ladder for them. That can be very difficult for some refugees. When I was working in Chicago, we had one Afghan refugee come in, and his name was Mr. Safi, and he was a professor in Afghanistan. And then he came here, and he was assembling boxes in a Staples factory. So, I mean, it's just such a big shift for many refugees. Or a lot of the Karen, or subsistence farmers, that's what they did. They farmed, and now they come here, and that's not something that can be a year-round occupation for them here. So there's a lot, the employment's a big struggle for a lot of refugees, and it's hard to work odd hours and ride the bus and not speak the language and do something that's menial and boring and degrading. That's where a lot of refugees have to start. Any other questions? Okay, we'll go into the co-sponsorship. I love co-sponsorship. I love it so much. I love it because it's really beneficial to the refugee families. It's beneficial to you guys, and personally I love it because I get to develop relationships with everybody on the team. And in case you haven't noticed, I'm super extroverted. My poor husband is like the biggest introvert I've ever met, and he's just like, your social needs are so exhausting. So the co-sponsorship helps meet my needs too. So refugees definitely need community support. The families I see matched with co-sponsorships are so much more successful, and their lives transform very quickly. At the end of the 90 days, they're at a totally different spot than those who don't have a co-sponsorship. They feel far less isolated, and they feel safer when they know that they have these friends who are there, who have their back. They learn their neighborhood and they learn English more quickly. They have American friends. That's really important for them to feel connected here, is to have American friends. They have a sustained hope and swifter progress towards self-sufficiency. Their dignity is restored. That's really important. Everything that they have experienced, even through resettlement, has just destroyed their dignity. And I can tell you that they're having to tell their story over and over and over and over again. And the people receiving their stories generally have to be very clinical and very non-reactionary to their stories. So even though their stories a lot of times are very traumatic and very personal, to tell it to somebody who is not affected by that is degrading. And so their dignity has just been slash, slash, slash throughout the whole process of becoming a refugee. Co-sponsorship really helps restore that dignity. It helps them realize their own value again. To see, I am worth these people's time. I'm worth these people's sacrifice of investing into my life. And I can have this good life here. And it's not going to be more of the same. It's not going to be more limbo. It's not going to be more struggle. There will be struggle, but I have people with me. And their hope grows. Generally, we see the first generation, it's tough. I mean, I think this is probably across the board for most immigrants. The first generation is pretty tough. Second generation is getting stronger and more established. Then the third generation can't even speak the native language to grandma and grandpa anymore. But it's really important to have those seeds of hope grow for the refugee families. They come here with hope. Refugees are incredibly resilient. To have survived everything that they've survived and fleeing their homes and decades in camps and being resettled here into poverty and having to learn a new language. I mean, some at 70 years old arrive and have to learn a new language, have to survive doctor's appointments and public assistance appointments and being so isolated. The camp is one positive side of the camp is that it's very appropriate to their culture. Everyone's together. There's a lot of community there. Here, we're so independent, and everything is so isolated here that it's really difficult. It's really difficult emotionally and mentally for refugees sometimes to be that isolated. So a co-sponsorship breaks that isolation, lets them know they have people here, and that they can have hope, and that hope just grows. So the benefits to you guys, it is really a transformational relational ministry opportunity. I was thinking just the other day how hospitality is such an overlooked ministry in the church. A lot of times when I was growing up, where I grew up and how I grew up, in a Baptist church, it was delegated strictly to the women. We made pies and casseroles and things. Now, but it's so much deeper than that. It is really about restoring dignity. It is really about providing that companionship to people when they are in their darkest times. And this is really what co-sponsorship is about. It's hospitality with shoes on and gloves on, ready to work hard. It gives you a new way of seeing the world and watching the news, and it increases and revitalizes community in the church and group. For some people, it will change your lives completely. I have a co-sponsorship group going right now, and one of the co-leaders was researching resources for refugees and found the ACR, which is the American Committee on Refugees. Yeah, American Refugee Committee, and she got a job with them. She is like a high-level IT person, and she's going to be traveling the globe, getting everything set up for the ARC with their IT division. So for her, it really did transform her life.